Well, anyone wondering how many large print Bibles can you fit on top of this pulpit? The answer is 4. So this evening, folks, I've decided to stand up here because it's easier for the recording. And I've decided to have this one recorded because I'm hoping some people who are not here might be able to catch it before Friday or catch it over the weekend. This evening what we're going to do is we're going to walk through 3 passages in order to try and better understand the 4th. We're essentially carrying on our studies in Ruth. And I'm minded at the moment to continue Ruth on Good Friday and Easter Sunday and draw straight lines between what Boaz has to do in this next chapter on Good Friday, the sacrificial "it is finished" nature of his redemption, redemptive work that Boaz points towards Jesus in, and then an ongoing redemption, the ongoing redemptive new life sense that we have on Easter Sunday. If that doesn't make much sense, it's my job to make it make sense between now and Easter Sunday. But before we get there, we've got a kind of a tricky legal problem to figure out together. Something that doesn't immediately make a lot of sense in Ruth. We're going to be mainly just spending our time in the 4 passages, but I'm going to try and help us understand what's going on in Ruth chapter 4. So we're going to start in Leviticus 25, I think. The main bit that I'm going to be talking about is on the screen, but you may not be able to see it. You might prefer to be in your Bibles. So at the end of Ruth 4, there is a court case at the gate. There are 10 elders of the town of Bethlehem there with Boaz and for what this evening's purposes I'm going to call the CR, the closer redeemer. The closer redeemer. He goes unnamed, probably or possibly he goes unnamed because his line does not continue as a result of his choices at this point. Or perhaps he's not named because he's considered a shameful character for his actions in Ruth chapter 4. But essentially, Boaz presents a legal argument before the elders and to the CR, not the RC, the CR. It's quite complicated what he's deriving from. And what he does is he combines the redemption law of Leviticus with the levirate law of Deuteronomy. CR, so the closer redeemer. I couldn't think of a better name to give him. He's the closer redeemer. He's closer in the redemptive line than Boaz is to Ruth and Naomi. So the CR. So we're going to start in Leviticus. We're going to be returning back to Leviticus 25. And if you can try and draw to mind all that work we did on the year of Jubilee, that sermon a little while ago. And if you missed that one, again, as much as I'm trying to supplement Ruth, this is also drawing on some previous strings, so you might need to go back. But you'll remember when we looked at Leviticus 25, we were looking at the holidays, and then we were looking at Sabbath years, and then we were looking at the Jubilee year. The 1 year in 50. And one of the aspects of the Jubilee year is we read of in Leviticus 25, verse 23. The land shall not, says the Lord, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then the nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the year since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. Okay, so we had a look at that a little bit when we were doing Leviticus 25. The key portion is if your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. I just want you to remember that verse in particular, because we're going to take that with us on our journey back to Ruth chapter 4. The key things to observe from Leviticus 25, the land is God's. So the land is God's, so it's to be taken seriously. The passage assumes that the Redeemer has the money to do the redeeming. Okay? So the Redeemer's got to be able to pay for the land and the crops all the way to the Jubilee year. This is essentially a right to buy back, so no one can permanently sell their land no matter how poor they get. They can sell it and they have the right to buy it back if they have the funds to do so. Not for what was given to them, but according to what's the crops back to the Jubilee year. The land can be sold to anyone, and then it can be redeemed by a redeemer, or it can be sold straight to the redeemer. This will become a little bit clearer on the next slide. What we have here in the kind of normative reading of Leviticus is if you're poor, you sell it to whoever will buy it, but then another family member might come along and buy it and redeem it so that it stays within the wider family, even if it doesn't stay within the immediate family. And then, when the 50th year comes, they can give it back to you. But there's no reason to suggest that you can't sell it directly to an immediate family member. You can't sell it to directly to the Redeemer. Kind of skips a step in the process, if you know what I mean. The closest Redeemer gets priority. That becomes important later. And as with the first bit, must be returned to the original holder's family at the Jubilee. The property has got to go back. Okay. So that's Leviticus 25. We'll come back to these ideas again, but try and hold on to these thoughts. So that's just a org chart, as it were, a flow chart. So Naomi becomes poor. The suggestion is she could sell it to one of her neighbors in Bethlehem, or she could sell it first to a redeemer. The redeemer would get right of refusal so that one day the land would return to Naomi, or if Naomi has died, it would return to her offspring. Of course, the thing you'll immediately notice is Naomi at that point in the story, the end of chapter 3, she doesn't have any offspring. So if Naomi dies, what's going to happen? So this is what's on the cards at the beginning of chapter 4. But Boaz decides to put that law together with Deuteronomy 25. So let's have a think about Deuteronomy 25. It was some time ago, I think it was on a Sunday and a Wednesday, we dealt with the law of the brother-in-law. And I said at that time that you needed to understand and know the law of the brother-in-law, or the levirate law, because it keeps coming up in the stories. And it comes up in this story, but it comes up indirectly. So I'll just remind us of it. Deuteronomy 25. Starting in verse 5, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she shall bear shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name might not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. You might remember the sermon I preached that was how the men need to keep their sandals on. What's the key idea here? That if your brother dies and leaves a wife and there are no children, there's no one to carry on the name, there's no one to hold on to the inheritance in Israel, then you're supposed to take that person as your wife and give them a child. That's the idea. The line must be perpetuated. The Levirate law mainly applies to brothers. It doesn't normally apply to wider family members. It applies to brothers, which will immediately make you think, well, hang on, how can you combine the Levirate law of Deuteronomy with Leviticus if one's to do with wider family members and one's only to do with brothers? We'll come back to that. It could be refused. You can choose, I do not want her, but it is a shaming thing to shirk your responsibilities in the text. The woman can take the sandal off and hit him with it and all the rest of it. And it must involve having children. It's not just so that the wife has got someone to look after them. It's so that the name can be perpetuated through having children. Okay. So that's Deuteronomy 25. We'll come back round to it. Before we go, Genesis 38. What are the consequences of, and again, we went into more detail when we did the law of the brother-in-law, but let's just remind ourselves of the consequences of not doing this correctly. The story of Judah and his sons. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would wet the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. What he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. I'm mainly just reminding us of the consequences of half following this law. Again, this will become important later. So what's the kind of the case study of Genesis 38? What's it conveying? Marrying but not sex with the partner as part of the brother-in-law marriage, that's not an option. Marrying but avoiding pregnancy, which is what Judah's son tries to do, that's not an option. And the consequence for marrying but not perpetuating the line is death in the story of Genesis 38. So this is high stakes stuff. And it will, as we'll see, it applies to Ruth chapter 4. So there's the three different passages, three different bits of information. I'm going to try and pull it all together now. We're going to try and reconstruct Boaz's thinking. Even if we don't have it, we do have his outcome, as it were. Let's now finally read Ruth chapter 4. This is our longest reading. So Naomi has encouraged Ruth to go to Boaz and to appeal to him in the night. And Boaz has said, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to redeem you, but there is somebody else who's closer by. And I need to go and deal with him first. And if he wants to have you, then he can have you. But if not, I will have you. He puts it a little bit more romantically than that in the text, but we'll deal with that a bit more on Friday. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So this is the closer Redeemer, the CR, okay? The Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend. Sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. So that's Boaz setting up the kind of the court, as it were, the public court. This was being witnessed by the elders. Then he said to the Redeemer, it's the closer Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you. And he said, that's the closer Redeemer says, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, this is the clever bit of legal trickery, as it were. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So the closer Redeemer initially in front of the elders says, yeah, I'll take the land. But then when Ruth is put on the table and Boaz asserts that he must take Ruth if he takes the land, he goes, oh, hang on a minute. I don't want the complete package. But again, what's interesting here is that Boaz is essentially combining two laws. He's combining Leviticus 25 with Deuteronomy 25. And he's asserting that if you do one, you must do the other. And the question is, well, what is the connection? Why does this legal argument stand up? Why doesn't the closer Redeemer go, hang on a minute, Boaz, I'm sure I can just redeem the field without marrying Ruth? Why do the elders not say, oh gosh, Boaz, that's a very novel argument. Are you sure you're not inventing up the law on the fly? Well, let's consider what Boaz has done here. The closer Redeemer was happy to take the land. Okay. Boaz asserts it before the judge. The closer Redeemer doesn't want it and forfeits. Why does Boaz assert this? And why does the closer Redeemer suddenly not want Ruth? Okay, I need to work out how to do charts better than this. That's not very clear. So let's walk through the logic. I'll walk through this table with you. Let's see if you can follow with me. Leviticus 25, you've got a choice. Do you redeem or do you not? Now, when you read Leviticus 25, if you've chosen to redeem, there's a series of things you have to do, and you have to do it in a particular way. Once you've decided to do it, you have to do the rest. There's an element of choice initially, but you've got to do it in a particular way. So there's choice, but not flexibility about how it's done. What can we observe? Well, if you're redeeming the land, there's a line of redemption. It starts with your closest family members and goes out a bit wider. At the end of Leviticus 25, it gets spelled out a little bit more. I'll just read that bit if I can find it, actually. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Okay, so that's the line of succession in a similar passage further down the same chapter. There is a line of redemption, and this is why Boaz has a problem. There's somebody closer in line. There's a closer relative, not actually Naomi's brother or brother-in-law, but somebody closer in line, a close relative closer than Boaz. But one of the things that Boaz is obviously observing is that in Leviticus, if you are a closer relative and you redeem, you act as a brother. You act as a brother. You step into the role of a brother if you redeem the land. So whether or not you're a brother or not, and brothers get first choosing, if you step into the role of a brother, you say, I'll be a brother to you, I'll redeem the land, then you act as a brother. And it seems clear that that's half the link, or a certain proportion of the link is that, well, hang on a minute, if in stepping into the role of redeemer, you step into the role of brother, therefore, the other rules about how brothers are supposed to behave, i.e. Deuteronomy 25, that also applies. So in this case, if you take on the land, you become Naomi's brother, and by extension, Ruth's brother. Naomi can't have children anymore. She's too old. Ruth can. Surely then the rules about brothers should apply to you. The second part of his argument, I think, it goes like this, that the land must be returned. The key thing about the redemption of the land is it must go back to the family. It must go back at year 50. The closer redeemer must give the land back. Now here's the snag. When he's first offered the land, there's going to be no one to give it back to. Naomi's not going to necessarily make it. There are no children on the scene. He's got no one to give it back to. So in theory, if he takes the land but doesn't take Ruth, and there are no children, he is acquiring the land of Elimelech forever. He is adding field to field. He is acquiring it in perpetuity. What do we know about the law in Leviticus 25? The one thing you're not supposed to do is acquire the land forever and ever. But if he's taking on, what Boaz recognizes here is that if he's taking on the privileges of a brother, i.e., I get first refusal on the land, I've got to take the responsibilities of a brother as well. And the responsibilities of a brother in this instance is to make sure that Elimelech line continues, in this case, through Ruth. So, Boaz's argument is, if you take the land, you must therefore take Ruth because you're a brother, and you must make sure that Ruth has children, as far as it's up to you, so that you can give the land back to the family again. This is the difference between being a redeemer and a Bethlehem real estate agent, okay? He's got to do the fullness. He can't have the privileges without the responsibilities. You remember, this is exactly what, in a slightly different way, this is what Judah's son was trying to do. He took the privileges, sexual contact with Tamar, but wasn't willing to take the responsibility. What are the consequences of that? Death in the story of Genesis 38. And so the CR is faced with this possibility. Okay, well, I'm going to take the land. I was happy to take the land. If I take Ruth, I'm going to have to give her children. And one of the things that's not on the table is she can't take on Ruth but not give her children. Because then he'll be in that same category of someone who is taking from his brothers and sisters in Israel but not perpetuating the line. You see the subtle difference there. And this is part of what persuades the closer redeemer, actually, I don't want the complete package. I don't want Ruth. The land isn't worth it to me. I don't want to have this land and then have to give it back to Ruth's children in the name of Elimelech. I don't want to do that. He realizes the consequences. There's a logic here. What the closer redeemer actually says in Ruth chapter 4 is, hang on. He says, I'll redeem it. And then as soon as Boaz mentions Naomi and Ruth, he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. What he's essentially saying here, and we don't get the specifics, but what he's essentially saying here is, hang on a minute, if I take on this field, and it's just for me, and I don't have to take on Ruth, that's fine, my kids will get it. However, if I have to take on the field and Ruth, and have children with Ruth, well, then there's going to be competing heirs in the household overall. This is going to cause trouble with my children. This might cause competition between the children. It might be that he's only got daughters, and he might have a male heir through Ruth, and then Elimelech will inherit his household instead. Again, we're not given the specifics, but this is the excuse that the closer redeemer gives. And in the light of all these different legal quandaries from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, suddenly what he has to say makes more sense. That there's going to be an issue with his own inheritance if he has to perpetuate the line. As I say, perhaps he doesn't want the field if he only has to give it back. Perhaps he's just saying that as an excuse. He doesn't really want Ruth. But there's a lot going on here. It's easy sometimes to assume that for whatever reason, the closer redeemer just didn't fancy Ruth and Boaz did. There's a lot more going on in the story. So just come back to the previous slide and just go back over this one more time. If the closer redeemer redeems the land, he takes on the role of a brother. Therefore, Deuteronomy 25 applies. If Deuteronomy 25 applies, and he's got to give back the land, then the closer redeemer has got to be with Ruth and try and give her children so that he can give the land back. And he chooses not to do that. And that's why the elders are all sat there going, that's a very clever legal argument, Boaz. That stands. That's why the closer redeemer goes, hang on, I don't want this anymore. He doesn't try and argue with Boaz. Well, Deuteronomy 25 and Leviticus 25, they don't add up. In amongst what Boaz is doing, and again, I don't have time to draw this out on a Sunday morning, but the purposes of this evening, what I want you to see is, as well as his generous work, Boaz is an extremely knowledgeable, clever redeemer. He knows the law. He knows the law well enough to make what we might call a novel argument, but it's a rock-solid novel argument. He knows Leviticus and Deuteronomy well enough to be able to legitimately put them together. And in so doing, and by presenting this in this way, it really does show that Boaz really does want to marry Ruth. He's not trying to palm her off to someone else, but he's trying to follow the process, but he's setting things up in such a way that he can win Ruth. He doesn't want her to go to an irresponsible man that's just in it for the field. He doesn't want the redemption to be partial. He wants the redemption to be complete. He wants the line to continue. That's Boaz's instinct. And so I think that just adds to Boaz's redemptive work and the cleverness of it. We talked a couple of Sundays ago about the righteousness of Boaz and how he knows the law of God. He knows how to recognize righteousness. Well, we know that in the time of Judges, where things in Israel were not good and there were lots of people who weren't following the law, Boaz was someone who knew the law like the back of his hand. And it legitimizes this approach to things, that you can go and win things in life. You can go and contest things in the courts for the sake of redemption, for the sake of righteousness. And you can employ legal arguments. What's the outcome? The closer redeemer shirks the responsibility. He wants the privileges, but not the responsibilities. And we don't even know his name. Did his inheritance even survive? Because Boaz is willing to move legal heaven and earth, he's willing to present his case before the elders of the town, not only is Ruth's line continue, but Boaz becomes associated and tied into the line, as we keep saying, of inheritance all the way to Christ. What an inheritance Boaz receives, not only by being responsible, but by knowing the law and fighting for Ruth in this way.